Welcome back for Europe. Now, we talked about the New World, the discovery of that of North America, Central South America, and now it's time to talk about the Old World, as its nickname would be that of Europe, the continent of Europe. And we have lots to talk about for Europe because there's a lot of exciting things happening with Europe, U.S.-European relations, and European relations around the world. The history of Europe, because a lot of cool things have happened. We have some of the earlier civilizations that have created things like the Roman and Greek empires, the Ottoman Empire, colonization around the world. Europe at one point was the center of the world, or so the Europeans thought so, and they decided to spread their ways around the entire part of the world. So whether it was their religion, their culture, their foods, their identities, their beliefs, their ideologies, their democracies, their economies, everything spread around the world from right here, the heart of Europe. So here we have a picture from Brussels, Belgium, among one of the considered to be the de facto capital of that of Europe because of a lot of organizations being centered here. We have headquarters here for the European Union and NATO, but more on that later because we have to take a step backwards and get started. Here you can see dozens of countries that make up the continent of Europe. Here we define this difference where we take the Eurasian continent, Eurasia, one large landmass, okay, and we divide it around the Ural Mountains of Russia, and we consider everything west of that to be Europe here on this landmass. And what the book calls this is Europe is an appendage of the landmass of Eurasia, and it's made up of several other appendages or peninsulas, if you will. You have the Iberian Peninsula here, Spain and Portugal. Italy itself is a peninsula. Greece is a peninsula. The large islands of the British Isles and Iceland, the large appendage of Scandinavia up in North Europe. And so we'll divide this area into North Europe, West Europe, Central Europe, and South Europe. And our friends of Eastern Europe, which would be places like the Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Russia, and those other countries we'll be talking about in Chapter 5, Russia and the post-Soviet states. A little hint, because they're all looped together because of the ideas of communism and that sphere of influence that Russia has had on that region. They've had their influence on some other regions of what would now be Central Europe, but they've started to look west, so we'll discuss that a bit further when we get into our sub-regions, of course, following the same format. We have 28 countries in the European Union, and like I said, divided into 4 distinct areas, and we'll talk about all these organizations and these countries in just a moment. But first, as always, a physical geography comes first. So we talk about this landmass of Europe coming from Greater Eurasia. We have a low-lying area, the northern European plain. We can think of this area to be somewhat of the breadbasket of Europe. If you gravitated to that Midwest, western part of the United States, and Canada as the breadbasket of North America, think of this area to be the breadbasket of Europe. And we have mountain ranges that are quite intense at times in terms of elevation. Not the types of mountains because of the range being a bit older. You're not going to have those high peaks like you would elsewhere in terms of elevation of quite what you would see in places like the Himalayas or something in Asia, which we didn't talk about yet, but some high mountain ranges like that, of course. But you'll see moderately high mountain ranges like the Alps, and you'll see other mountain ranges that are important to discuss like the Apennines, which run through Italy as if it would be a spine. The Balkan Mountains on the Balkan Peninsula, and those are the states of the former Yugoslavia. And so the Balkan Peninsula and Balkan Mountains would be somewhat easy to remember those two to be tied together. The Pyrenees Mountains that separate and form somewhat of a natural border between France and Spain. We have it should be said, I guess, that the Alps kind of taper off into a little bit more docile mountain range and form the Carpathian Mountains that run through part of Czech Republic, Poland, mostly through Slovakia, down into that of Romania. And so you can see, as if you'd imagine this mountain chain here and curving off there. We have, of course, the northern European plain that I mentioned, a flat, low-lying area, relatively speaking, to the rest of Europe, which is separated into these sort of other distinct mountain ranges in distinct areas. And you have, of course, lowland areas in the British Isles, mountainous areas of Norway and parts of Sweden, low-lying area in Finland, a lot of lakes. We could think of this area, maybe if we think of it from a U.S. standard, maybe think of something like Minnesota, if that would help you in terms of land of thousands of lakes like that. And to imagine a low-lying area with a lot of glacial lakes. And of course the Black Sea, Baltic Sea, North Sea. Understand that areas that are bordering these types of seas obviously rely on them for whether it be fishing or oil reserves there. This area in the Mediterranean, which is a whole different discussion in terms of its entirety being associated with the Mediterranean Sea for agriculture, for its economy, for its tourism, for its livelihood. And we'll be talking about that more in depth in the subregion section, of course. To picture it, because I like to use some visuals in order to, rather than me just point and try to describe these places, you can take a look at them for yourselves without actually going. The Alps, again, like I mentioned, the Alps are Europe's greatest peaks. That would be the Alps in parts of France and Switzerland, tapering off into Austria. And you can see that this area is in fact quite mountainous, and it's what's left places like Switzerland to be somewhat characterized as a mountainous country and somewhat quite remote, if you will, from a physical geography standpoint, but they're quite connected in terms of their economy and their livelihoods otherwise. The Apennine Mountains, you can see a bit smoother of a mountain chain running down through north to south through Italy. A fjord. Now, a fjord is a steep physical geographic feature that best is characterized in places like Norway, and of course here's one pictured here in Norway, and then I've included this picture from northern Spain. It's a little bit more of a highland area. This is from the St. James Way. It's like our Appalachian Trail, if you will, that runs through the course of northern Spain. So you can picture some of these mountainous areas, a little bit of a highland area, and then other areas as well. Continue with some mountainous areas, those Alps that taper off down into the Balkans. You have the Albanian Alps. Low-lying areas would be that of parts of, remember that area of Germany and Poland, some other places like that in the north-central area. Hesse, Germany, there's a lake here, just not any significant lake, but just to demonstrate that the physical geography of that local area. It's not all mountains and hills, as you can see. The Tatry Mountains in Slovakia are part of that Carpathian chain. Here in Slovakia, there are the Tatry Mountains. They'd be known as the Tatras. Elsewhere, there's the Low Tatras, which are just south of the Tatra Mountains. They form a border between Poland and Slovakia. Gerlach Peak being the highest peak in the Tatra chain, that being in the Tatries in Slovakia. Tulip fields in the Netherlands. You might think of the Netherlands, you think of the Dutch, you think of Amsterdam, you think of coffee shops, red light districts. What you're thinking there is you're thinking probably marijuana and prostitution. But you can also think about windmills and energy efficiency with renewables. You can also think of, they're known for tulips. They do some tulip production, but I think the fields are fascinating to look at, so I include it for that standpoint. But again, to just show that low, flat-lying area for an area that's very well connected with the water, does leave them a little bit susceptible to climate change, but they're doing an excellent job handling that, and more on that later when it's time. So we want to think about the climate like usual. We think of the physical geography and how that dictates where people live and how they live there, and the whys. There's questions of whys that we started to talk about in the introductory chapter, what feels like a very long time ago. And now the climate. And the climate obviously has influenced the physical geography, and the climate influences that of the human interactions with the environment. And so you can see here the climate types throughout Europe. Makes total sense, of course, that the Mediterranean climate that we talked about in California and part of the western part of the United States and part of the New World, we finally see its origin, the Mediterranean Sea and the Mediterranean region, the Mediterranean climate. Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, parts of the Balkan Peninsula here, and what would be former Yugoslavia, that Mediterranean climate, and we'll be describing those in just a second. You can see the marine west coast climate here, much of this area that's getting fronts from the Atlantic Ocean, pushing precipitation coming off the Atlantic. That's why you see areas like Ireland and the United Kingdom and the west coast of France getting its fair share of rainfall for world standards, and then obviously working its way into the greater part of the continent. Now, the more you move into the continent, the more you would stumble into that humid continental. And if you remember humid continental being that area, and the more you move into a landmass, the greater likelihood that you would have that humid continental type of climate. We talked about that before, where you see greater variations between temperatures because they don't have that influence of a body of water to dictate that constant temperature. So you'd see here, you could have hot summers, cold winters, and you'd see a greater level of extremes happening here as you'd move further into this giant landmass of Eurasia. And of course, the subarctic conditions as you'd move up, because the Arctic Circle is right here, and so it's obviously important to understand that this area is quite north in latitude, especially when we move up into North Europe, up near the Norwegian Sea. And so just to recap on that, put some words down for you as you're clicking through this when you're reading as it's posted. Mid-latitude, temperate climate, like I mentioned. Now this is most of Europe is mid-latitude temperate climate, and you see this is moist all year with mild winters and mild to hot summers, and that could be described, like I said, as a majority of Europe. Obviously the Mediterranean, off the Mediterranean Sea, it has these areas that are rich for agriculture, obviously rich for tourism, as well as they can enjoy that local atmosphere. And I just described the continental climates, which I just said described as moving more inward, and you have that temperature extremes where you have those hotter summers, colder winters, and that no real level of consistency really with your climate. Now the environment comes to be discussed in this lens through climate change. And now Europe leads the world in climate change action and their response to climate change. They get a gold or blue ribbon with some gold on it, so win the little prize there. Paris Climate Accord, of course, this isn't the only type of climate accord that's ever come our way. We've seen the Kyoto Protocol, we've seen other treaties and accords and protocols that have come our way in the introductory chapter, so we won't go backwards in describing that. But Paris is the center for this new discussion that took place in 2015 and 16. We know that every country in the world had signed on except for the countries of Syria and Nicaragua. And then we know that the United States pulls out under Donald Trump. That decision, the plan to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord. And then since we saw that actually Syria and Nicaragua has gotten on board, so that's where things stand with the Paris Climate Accord. But what this is it's a commitment to make adequate progress in terms of, so when we know that the climate change is happening, the global temperatures are warming, this initiative wants to make sure that it tries to mitigate or curb that control where instead of moving more than 2 degrees, we want to try to stabilize that warming process. We want to finance climate change initiatives, and we want to make commitments for carbon emission controls. And so what that means, and this isn't as strict as what previous climate change agreements would be. This is a little bit of self-policing, self-financing. You pledge your amount of what you think would go and contribute to this. And so where it stands is the world is on board, absent the United States. Europe, of course, leading the way in climate change initiatives on national levels, but even in local communities as well. The influence of green political parties in Europe is a bit more influential than our Green Party here in the United States. Our Green Party here in the United States is largely absent from national politics, absent from a lot of politics, to be frank. But that's because we're typically, again, a two-party system, that Republican versus Democrat. You really don't see the influence of smaller political parties like you will see in Europe, where they have a large variety of political parties to try to tap into those more localized interests, and so you don't see these big tent parties where a lot of differences between candidates. They're split up into many different political parties, and they form usually in the sense that they're forming coalition governments where these small political parties make arrangements to govern together under sort of a partnership, if you will. So green political parties have a bit more influence in dictating European politics, and like I said, Denmark, just like the Netherlands and some of these areas, and do a great job in terms of leading the world in wind power. 40% of their country's needs come from wind turbines, and I mentioned before the Netherlands and their idea. They're also known for their construction of levees because they're actually situated below sea level, and they also are known for their wind turbines, also Spain in the market as well. So again, many countries in Europe known for their leadership in response to climate change. And furthermore, in terms of transportation, the book talks about this a little bit, but more so, we don't know this so much from the book, but as we know, we're just experiencing it in our day-to-day lives. If you turn on the news, you see a lot of countries are phasing out the sale of gas and diesel vehicles in Europe. And what that means, they're going to quit selling them. They're obviously going to be on the roads, and at a certain point, that too will phase out. Norway makes the most ambitious pledge, 2025, no more selling gas and diesel vehicles. 2032 in Scotland. Scotland is a constituent country of the United Kingdom. United Kingdom makes a slightly more realistic or a type of pledge with France in 2040. And Paris, again, as a city, made the promise as well, but it eventually went national. Volvo is a Swedish car company, and they've pledged to only sell electric or hybrid vehicles starting in 2019. That's quickly approaching next year already. And the idea of upgrading shipping lanes and focusing on public transportation in Europe because of their dense urban centers has led them to be able to lead the way in transportation regarding energy efficiency, reduction in carbon emissions, and this idea of being environmentally friendly. Now, Europe is vulnerable to climate change as other parts of the world. We talked about areas being more or less vulnerable in the United States. We talked about the United States. We are vulnerable in our Midwest because of soil erosion and agriculture and different climate change because of literally climate variability. We talked about areas like New Orleans and Miami and places being along the coast, being at or near sea level, to be vulnerable to sea level rise and these types of things. And we talked about in the United States that our ability to curb climate change because of in terms of our infrastructure, because we have the finances. Europe too, of course, has the resources to invest in climate change mitigation and adaptation, unlike other parts of the world, as we'll see in places like South and Southeast Asia that might, of course, not be able to take on the same kinds of initiatives. Here is an image that was put together during Agriculture and Rural Development study that decides to break down the climate zones and general regions, sub-regions of Europe, and breaks it down into their risks that would be occurring in the area to leave them vulnerable to climate change. So we have flood risks, of course, where the area in fact is its most wettest places that typically, historically, the wettest areas. There would be risks to floods because, again, areas like the Netherlands and places in Denmark that sit at or below sea level, obviously urban areas that sit right along the water, they need to have these alternative ideas of how to combat rising sea levels. Dams and levees that are being built by technological innovation and engineering has been able to pave the way for that kind of mitigation in parts of the coastal areas. The water availability has been an issue in and around the Mediterranean region. Risks of drought and soil erosion, again, tying together with agricultural practices. Shorter growing seasons, and a reduction would be then in optimal crop areas. Places like France and Italy and Spain, big grape producers, big in wine, and it's obviously going to play a role in both the economy and the way people can live and thrive. Differences in climatic features, such as rainfall varying amounts. Again, that breadbasket area will face areas of yield issues with the crop production, soil erosion, just as we saw in the Midwest United States, and we'll see different growing seasons occurring in that of Scandinavia. We'll actually see increased growing seasons and increased farmland in some areas because it was in fact colder areas, so that area will become more mild, but they'll also face a reduction in summer rainfall and a greater likelihood of winter storms and floods. So obviously bad news for a lot of these places because of climate change, but areas that they're going to try to obviously mitigate and adapt to as climate change continues to threaten society. Heat waves, a big problem. Tens of thousands of people actually have died throughout Europe from heat waves, most notably in 2003 in France. In 2010 and 12, there's additional heat waves. There's heat waves more frequently, but these sort of wide-scale heat waves, most notably in 2003 heat wave, killing thousands of people. And it's just in fact extreme at times, and areas that, again, most vulnerable too. Now, Europe's energy needs, we know that there is a commitment to be energy efficient in terms of renewable energy use, sort of stepping away from fossil fuels, greater commitment to that than what we see in the United States, North America, and obviously Central and South America. So around 30% of the European Union's energy, that is oil, natural gas, and coal, comes from Russia. There was a debate mentioned even in the book that they were fearful that there would become a reliance on Russia for these energy needs. It's similar to the dialogue in the United States that we're reliant on the Middle Eastern region because of our energy needs for oil, and so this turns to really be not so much the case because this is an overwhelming amount of Russia's budget that they can make these deals by shipping these resources to the European Union, and so it turns out to be not so much of a critical issue as it has expected, but it did leave areas between Russia and the European Union, specifically Russia and the Ukraine, with these gas pipelines that were become very contentious at times, but more on that in Russia and the post-Soviet states chapter. We won't get too ahead of ourselves, but nuclear power in Europe is more stronger in the sense that it's more widely accepted than it is in the United States. About a quarter of the EU's energy needs comes from nuclear energy, specifically in France, one of the leaders in nuclear energy in Europe. 75% of its electricity needs comes from nuclear energy. Now there is a commitment to begin to reduce that. However, to put that in perspective, only about 20% of the United States' energy needs comes from nuclear energy. You can see a greater commitment here in the European Union, specifically in France, and even some of the areas that were under the sphere of communism for so long. Here's the Mochovce nuclear power plant in Nitra, Slovakia. Again, an area that was controlled, influenced by the Soviet Union for some time. And they look to that direction sometimes for its nuclear energy production, its nuclear energy needs. 20% of Slovakia's energy now comes from nuclear energy, and so that area sort of helped them become not so reliant on fossil fuels. And natural gas pipeline station here in Primda, Czech Republic, is an example of those webs of pipelines that run through Europe, coming from Russia, mostly all of them running from the Ukraine until those gas disputes occurred and they started to run elsewhere. But again, we'll touch more on that in just a moment. Again, on the energy, France has made a commitment that coal will no longer be used to produce electricity by 2022. Again, upcoming, like we see these commitments by 2019, 2022, 2025. These are just a few years away, so it's going to be exciting to see. Well, I think it's exciting to see whether these things will actually come to fruition. We have areas that are plagued in the central part of Europe, especially with acid rain, and we talked about that in the eastern part of the United States. Why? Because that area gets a little bit more rainfall than the other part, and because of the core industrial areas. Same thing, think about that, it's not a novel idea. The areas that get a little bit more rain and old industrial centers in Europe, more prime candidates for the destruction of acid rain. Here in southern Poland, you can see the sort of devastating ecological effects of industry here. And so air and water pollution are a problem throughout the industrial world, of course, and Europe is no exception despite their progress on climate change initiatives. Water pollution is a problem, especially for the Mediterranean Sea. If you know your European geography, which, you know, that's what we're here for, you'll see that between the African continent and the European continent is just a very small strait called the Strait of Gibraltar that opens up the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea together. And that area is so small that it's said to have taken 80 years for water to recycle itself through the Mediterranean Sea with fresh water back out to the Atlantic Ocean. You can imagine the impact of humans on the environment and our pollution and what that means for the water quality of that of the Mediterranean Sea. and so it's quite a polluted body of water. Now that wraps up the physical geography, the climate, and the energy and environment needs of Europe, and that means we'll stay tuned and we'll be moving into part 2, human aspects of Europe.